Henry VIII's reign over England is categorised by much brutality, execution and religious turmoil. The infamous king, who had 6 wives, brought monumental change to the country throughout his kingship, and one of the biggest policies implemented was the dissolution of the monasteries. It was a time in which huge religious change gripped the nation, and the closing of monastic houses and priories was all motivated by greed and the crown's need for money to fund their foreign wars. To defy the king's beliefs and his ideas at this time was incredibly dangerous, and there was a huge number of victims during the dissolution and closure of the religious houses, such as Richard Whiting, the abbot of Glastonbury Abbey, who was hung, drawn and quartered in front of his own monastic house for refusing to hand over control to the crown. Also there's Hugh Farringdon, the abbot of Reading Abbey, who also suffered the same fate. Join us today as we look at Henry VIII's brutal dissolution of the monasteries, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. During the Tudor period, there were a number of religious houses across the nation that could trace their history back to the Anglo-Saxon era. When Henry became king in 1509, there were more than 850 religious houses in England and also in Wales. These varied in size from large monasteries to smaller priories, nunneries and friaries. Inside these, those living within the order's rule would follow a simple life devoted to God and religious study. They also provided care for the sick and the poor, and even offered educational services in the local community. Monks lived isolated lives in self-sufficient communities, but friars would provide services to the local area. All monks and nuns took a vow of celibacy and wore habits, and the main purpose of the religious houses was to maintain a daily routine of prayer. At least 8 times a day the communities would get together to sing and recite prayers. By the Tudor period, around 2/3 of the religious houses were small buildings, and many only were home to a few monks and nuns. These did not possess much land too, and in England just over a dozen of England's nunneries were large. The monks living in these houses at this time spent a lot of their money on food, and they did sometimes indulge, with one house having regular 16-course meals of the best food available. They tended to also, during the 15th century, employ a large amount of servants, and the monks even paid actors to provide entertainment. These expenses did attract criticism for the monasteries at the time. Around the 1500s, monasteries also owned a lot of land, around 25% of all farmland in England. Farmers who would rent their land often reported how the monks were sometimes greedy. At this time, religious reformers such as Martin Luther began to criticise the Catholic Church and begin the Reformation, and monks were not exempt from this criticism. It wasn't just Henry VIII who would shut down many monasteries. Previously, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, who acted as the Lord Chancellor for King Henry, did also this. In 1519 he sent inspectors to the monasteries to keep a check on what was happening inside and to inspect the conditions and also the behaviours of the monks. One example of poor behaviour was recorded at Peterborough Monastery, in which the abbot was caught selling wood for profit and keeping the money himself, and also keeping a mistress inside his chamber. Wolsey then punished those who were guilty of not living clean lives, and he issued further guidelines to improve behaviour. Because of the reports, Wolsey himself shut down around 30 monastic houses and suppressed them. With this, he used the money and wealth himself to pay for a school he set up in Ipswich, and also to establish a college in Oxford. It would be one of his lawyers, Thomas Cromwell, who would help with selling off the lands and riches owned by these suppressed houses. The dissolution of the monasteries in England, carried out by Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell, later on emerged following an attack on the Roman Catholic Church, known as the Protestant Reformation. Protestantism had spread across Europe, and during this time different European countries had adopted the Lutheran or Protestant faith. Henry VIII is mostly known for his 6 wives, and it is with his marriages and love life that his break from the Catholic Church came. Henry had been married to his first wife Catherine of Aragon for quite a while, when he began his pursuit of Anne Boleyn in spring 1526. She would soon become his second wife, but Catherine and Henry's marriage had not borne a son, and Henry had become obsessed with the thought of having a male heir in order to continue the Tudor dynasty. Catherine was becoming older, and the king's eyes drifted to the younger Anne Boleyn, who had previously refused to become his mistress. Henry then greatly sought to annul his marriage to Catherine, so he would be free to marry Anne Boleyn. Cardinal Wolsey was put to work to do this, but he failed to get the Pope's permission to agree to an annulment or divorce. The king grew increasingly frustrated at the Pope's refusal, and following this decided to break from Rome, and in 1534 he would declare himself the supreme head of the Church of England. Henry began a systematic reform of religion across the country, and he began to issue more Protestant statutes. The king, however, also needed more money in order to line the royal coffers. He was increasingly in debt and in need of money to fund his European campaigns, and for this his attention turned to the Catholic monasteries and religious houses. In order to secure the finances, Henry put one of his closest friends and advisors, Thomas Cromwell, to the task. Cromwell had previous experience with dissolving monasteries under Cardinal Wolsey, but in early 1535 he was appointed to the position of the Vicar General. This made him the king's second in command over the church. Cromwell himself had been a supporter of religious reformers, and in early June 1535 he sent a letter to all of the bishops in England. He ordered them to support the Act of Supremacy and asked them to make sure that all parishes and clergy supported the king as the head of the church rather than the Pope. To oppose this was incredibly dangerous, and many people did lose their lives, including some of Henry's closest advisors such as Thomas More. He later, in September 1535, suspended the authority of all the bishops so that 6 of his lawyers and investigators could complete surveys of the monasteries. They were given 86 questions, and it was clear that any tiny discrepancy within the monastery could lead to the crown taking possession of the religious house. Any slight misbehaviour or corruption, and Cromwell could steal the land, the order's riches, and shut them down, with all the wealth and money being transferred into the royal treasury. Any example of a monk or nun not living a perfect life, and the order would be shut straight down. Cromwell, when the reports came back, was shocked, and there were a number of accusations levelled against different friaries and abbeys. For example, one abbot was accused of stealing money from the abbey, and also wasting resources. Another was accused of keeping prostitutes, and another was even found in bed with a woman at 11 o'clock in the morning. There were also widespread accusations of drunkenness. Nuns also attracted criticism, and Cromwell's first action was to remove the abbots in charge of these corrupt orders. Parliament was called in February 1536 to debate the findings, and the king wanted the closure of monasteries to be done on an individual basis. However, Cromwell persuaded the king that this would be better done by an Act of Parliament. Within Parliament, support was gathering for the closure of smaller monasteries, and on the 14th of April 1536, the Act for the Dissolution of the Monasteries was passed and received royal assent. This outlined that all religious houses with an annual income less than £200 were to be suppressed, with the king and crown taking control. Because of this, around 30% of all religious houses were closed by the Act. Within the buildings, all high-value items such as roofing lead and bells became property of the king, and all precious artefacts, metals and altar furnishings also were transferred to the treasury. They sold off all of the household goods and farming goods, and the crown placed new tenants in charge of the land. The monastic land was seized too and sold off cheaply to nobles and merchants. These merchants then sold off the land to many other people, and therefore lots of the population benefited from the closures and therefore supported the king. There were a number of abbots and religious leaders who failed to comply with these actions and the king's demands. Because of this, they were usually locked up in prison, or sometimes were even executed. Earlier we mentioned the abbot of Reading Abbey, Hugh Farringdon, who was even hanged, drawn and quartered in front of his own monastery for his role in protesting against the suppressions. His remains were then, following the execution, even displayed in a sixth site in front of his own abbey. Thousands of monks and nuns were also made homeless, and many of the monasteries were ruined and destroyed. Thousands more servants also found themselves unemployed and destined for a life being poor and jobless. This brutality and savagery did attract a lot of criticism, especially in the north, when uprisings such as the Pilgrimage of Grace took place. In October 1536, a large rebel army of around 30,000 people marched into York and demanded that the monasteries should be reopened. Henry eventually put down the rebellion with the arrest and execution of around 200 people linked to the uprising. As time went on, Cromwell continued to wield his axe when it came to shutting down the monasteries. The crown began to become incredibly rich from these closures, and it was one of the biggest land grabs in English history. With this wealth, Henry could fund his military campaigns, and he spent much of the riches on his royal court as well. Cromwell would persevere, and began in early 1538 to turn towards religious shrines as well. Pilgrims for a long time had visited shrines that contained important relics, and wealthy pilgrims often gave jewels at these shrines. Cromwell persuaded the king to agree to also shut these down, and once again commissioners were sent around England to seize the relics and the shrines. From this, the king got even richer. The shrine of Thomas Becket was said to be the richest in England, and was destroyed with all of its riches taken, and it was said that the chests of jewels taken away were so heavy that 6 or 8 strong men had to carry them. Henry following this was excommunicated and banned from the Catholic Church, and he now continued to go even further. Between 1536 and 1540, over 850 monastic houses were closed. Henry did award pensions to those monks and nuns who didn't oppose the king. However, as inflation was occurring across England, the pensions were not enough, and many monks and nuns fell quickly into poverty. One of the biggest and saddest legacies of the Dissolution was also the fact that monastic libraries were destroyed, and thousands of precious and important manuscripts and books were lost. The dissolutions of the monasteries was an event that changed England forever. It was born first out of the king's desire to take as much wealth as he could from the Catholic Church and the religious houses within England. Henry greatly needed wealth to fund his campaigns, but the brutality in which the suppression was carried out left horrific stories of execution and punishment, along with great suffering. Cromwell is known today as the villain who wielded the axe for so many of the houses. Across the country today, you can still see the remains and the legacy of the brutal dissolution in many ruined monastic buildings and abbeys that stand tall today, as a reminder of England's most notorious king's quest for wealth and how he would stop at absolutely nothing to get that. Once again, thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.